President Xi Jinping announced the country's new climate goals during this year's United Nations Climate Summit. Countries are required to submit their national climate plans, known as nationally determined contributions. That's part of the Paris Agreement, the landmark treaty that 195 countries adopted 10 years ago to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Here is UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
We are in the dawn of a new energy era. We must seize this moment of opportunity. COP30 in Brazil must conclude with a credible global response plan to get us on track.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Virginia, Michael Shank is an adjunct professor of sustainable development at New York University. And from Seattle, we're joined by Yixing Xu. He is the former research director at Breakthrough Energy. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Yixing Xu, let me start with you. So this announcement by President Xi Jinping on the country's new nationally determined contributions that he made at that UN Climate Summit. What can you tell us about the announcement?
Yeah, I think this announcement is great. It shows China's commitment to fight climate change continuously, and they have been doing so tremendously really well in the past several decades, and will continue this effort. I think several numbers are very encouraging, including the emission reduction from the peak by 2035 will be about 7 to 10%. And the share of non-fossil energy in total energy consumption will be greater than 30%, and wind plus solar installed capacity will be more than 3,600 gigawatts. Those are really large numbers, and according to previous experience, normally China tends to make a relatively conservative commitment, and later on they actually can overachieve it by quite a bit. So I'm very looking forward to hearing great news from China in the future when they overachieve this commitment. But this commitment itself is already great. I think this is a huge contribution from China to fight climate change with the other countries in the world.
So Yixing Xu, the general trend is towards the use of more renewables in China, but of course, China can't do it all by itself. President Xi also talked about global governance. He talked about global climate governance, and he called on countries to deepen cooperation. How important is that everybody pulls in the same direction, that there is a multilateral approach to this?
That's absolutely very important, because fighting climate change is really not just something one country can do. Even China completely eliminated its carbon emission. If other countries cannot do the same, it's not helpful enough to reverse the global warming and fight climate change. So I think President Xi is absolutely correct. Like the collaboration between the countries and across the globe, between all the governments, are very critical. And I also think that China can contribute a lot in this area, meaning that when other countries also make commitments around reducing their carbon emissions and using more renewable energies, China can export its high quality and low cost solar panels, for example, energy storage, etc., to other countries to help the world to fight climate change. So I think China's robust supply chain in clean energy industry and also electric vehicle industry can help a lot of countries to achieve their climate goals.
Michael Shank, good to see you, Michael. So we have something of a progress report there from China. We know what China has achieved, what it's accomplished, and where it wants to head to from here. But what about the rest of the world?
Well, the EU has committed to roughly 60 to 70% emissions reduction by 2035. At least that's what's estimated. They haven't finalized that emissions reduction goal yet. Of course, we know the US is clawing back every single climate commitment the United States government has ever made. So the US is not a mover and shaker in this space, certainly won't be in Brazil at COP30, but the players to watch include Brazil, which is also committed to a pretty aggressive emissions reduction goal by 2035. So between the EU, Brazil, obviously China stepping up to the plate here in some significant ways, they will be shaping the conversation at COP30.
Right. And Michael, you know, we hear the terminology about getting to carbon neutrality, about peaking carbon emissions. What does that mean? I mean, for instance, we have China. It's planning on peaking carbon emissions before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. How does that work?
Here's why that's important. So if you look at the carbon budget, basically that's the budget that we can spend at current rates. It runs out in 2 years if we want to stay under 1.5 degrees warming from pre-industrial temps, which is what we agreed to in Paris 10 years ago. So that's why peaking emissions is so important, because we have to stay within that budget. Now, carbon neutrality is drawing down a lot of the carbon that's in the air. Last year saw the most carbon in the air ever on record. And so we got to draw that down. There are many ways to draw that down. Naturally, we can draw that down into the soil, into forests, into mangroves. And so thus begins the work of reforesting, restoring our forests, our soils, our mangroves, so we can draw that carbon down. That's the game plan in carbon neutrality.
Okay, well, joining the conversation now from Rio de Janeiro is Sejan Estefan. He is Director General at the National Institute for Ocean Research. Sejan, great to have you with us. Now, this is, you know, we're talking about the climate targets that China has proposed. It's the first time China has proposed this set of targets and focused on the economy as well, and the reduction of greenhouse gases. Brazil is doing something similar, as Michael pointed out, also plans to end deforestation by 2030. So what more can you tell us about these measures that Brazil is taking?
It's the priority of our country is stop deforestation. In fact, Brazil has relatively clean energy metrics, and this is not the big issue in relation to emissions. We are trying to take care of deforestation. This is the main point that we can achieve in the 2030 to decrease our emissions. And in terms of the ocean, we think that the ocean could come to the center of the agenda, because the influence of the ocean on the climate, especially in relation to the melting of Antarctica, it's a big issue. And we should try to stop this increasing of temperature on the ocean and to avoid the melting of the polar areas, because it could raise the ocean level. It could influence the currents in terms of the general movement of the currents all over the planet. I think, and this is another point that we're trying to stress, is trying to bring the ocean for the center of the climate agenda for the next years.
Okay, and now also joining us from Chicago is Thomas Gell. He is the president of Ample Luck International Capital Corporation and the former environmental advisor to United States President Bill Clinton. Thomas, great to have you with us. We're talking about the recent UN climate conference and the targets that have been set, the hopes that many countries have in this battle against climate change. Specifically looking at China, its total installed renewable power capacity, Thomas, reached 1.41 billion kilowatts by the end of 2024. And China has set a very ambitious target to move to renewables by 2030. I mean, how would you assess progress so far on these efforts to combat climate change?
Well, I'm very fortunate. I live half time in China, and I have to give a lot of praise to the Chinese government and Chinese people for installing more renewable resources than any other country in the world. And on solar, they've installed more than the rest of the world combined. So they're doing an amazing job on trying to step forward to the new generation of renewable resources to be able to accomplish it. One of the problems is that where the solar is, they lose almost half in transmission lines. So it's trying to balance that equation to be able to get the power to the users in an efficient manner. And I think that China is grappling with that, with new transmission lines, with moving companies that are high energy users to the source. And so I think that they're being very aggressive in being able to resolve many of these problems.
That's interesting, the fact that they lose half the amount of power in the transmission line. Why is that?
Because again, it's just a physics relationship that with power through transmission line in distance, you just normally lose the power as per kilometer that it has to travel. So if you're generating the renewable energy in the desert and then trying to move it to the higher use areas in Beijing or Shanghai or Chongqing, then it has thousands of kilometers that has to go through the wires to be able to get to the ultimate user, and that degrades the total amount of electricity that's there. So by trying to move high energy users to where the solar generation is happening is very effective, or on being able to move the generation to the cities on buildings and windows and other places where you can generate electricity from the sun, then that can be helpful to be able to equal the equation. But China's done a wonderful job in being very aggressive in that area.
Yixing Xu, one of the big challenges, of course, is that of in this fight against climate change is the challenge that is posed in developing countries, in the global south, as it's sometimes called, and that is mainly a question of finance to mitigate the effects of climate change, as well as finance to move towards more renewable sources of energy. Well, China is involved there as well. There is finance up to a point from China. There needs to be more finance. Many of these countries in the global south have already experienced the effects of extreme weather. I mean, what can you tell us about the agreements that China have made with many of these countries in the global south? And I know that China is also running these capacity building workshops as well in these countries.
Yeah, China's done an amazing job in being able to...
Sorry, Thomas. I'll get to you, Thomas. Yixing Xu, go ahead, and then I'll get to Thomas. Yeah.
Sure. So I think one of the main challenges around building more renewable energy capacity is that the capital investments for renewable energy generation is much higher than the fossil fuel generation. However, the operating cost of renewable energy generation is almost zero, which is much lower than fossil fuel generation. So this characteristic of renewable energy generation capacity requires a much more initial kind of capital investment at the very beginning. So I think China is helping other developing countries to invest in more renewable energy capacities by financing for them. I think this is a very critical step for China to help other countries to get started and contribute more to the fight against climate change. And I think this initial investment will pay off in the next, for example, 15 to 20 years when these wind and solar farms are generating electricity for those countries. So I think the finance part is absolutely critical in this renewable clean energy transition, and China is doing a lot to help them. And of course, with renewable energy capacity, there are several other challenges. I think China is also helping other countries. One of them is how to do the planning properly. For example, renewables are normally redundant in a relatively remote areas. And if you build renewables there in the remote areas, you need to also build a long distance transmission line. And sometimes you need to build high voltage or super high voltage long distance transmission lines because you want to reduce the energy loss when you deliver the energy from the renewable side to the demand center. So I think this type of planning and initial investment are also critical for China to help other countries.
And Thomas, what is your view on this? Because I was looking at some of the figures. You know, I did say China is involved in financing some of these developing countries. Well, that number is $24.8 billion since 2016, but that's a fraction of the amount that's needed in total, which is something like $470 billion. Thomas?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, again, China's done a wonderful job in the Belt and Road Initiative to try to encourage a lot of the countries to be able to do green projects. But you're right, that we've only scratched the surface on what can be accomplished. And I think that working with the developing countries, being able to provide the financial and the technical resources to be able to help them to do things in the best manner is very important for world development. So I again, applaud China for their outreach to be able to accomplish these goals.
Michael Shank, there was a report published by Tsinghua University. It's the 2025 Global Carbon Neutrality Annual Progress Report. And I'm going to read you a little bit of what it says here. It says, this year's report identifies a profound structural imbalance. While ambition and innovation are driving progress, they're being severely undermined by bottlenecks in climate finance and international cooperation. This has created a significant implementation gap between stated goals and tangible results. So, Michael, how big is that gap?
The gap is great, and I encourage everyone to check out that report. I read it earlier today, and China, to its credit, is trying to close the gap, with President Xi saying in his video address to the UN General Assembly that they're going to increase sixfold solar and wind in the next 10 years is pretty phenomenal, given that China's already, as guests have mentioned on this conversation, that China's leading the world in wind and solar and battery storage and heat pumps and electric vehicles. So the implementation gap is being closed by innovators like China. Unfortunately, I think the market is going to drive this versus international cooperation, because we're just not seeing it in the United States. We're not seeing it at the level we should in the EU. And if we're not going to get a more ambitious pledge and NDCs at COP30, what does that mean for any of the gaps identified in this report? So unfortunately, I think the market's going to drive it because of China's investments. These prices on wind, solar, battery storage, EVs, and heat pumps are being driven downward because of those investments. And that's ultimately what will close the gap, I think.
Okay. Serjan Estefan, the Chilean Environment Minister Mesa Rojas Corradi, he spoke with Xi Jinping at this year's UN General Assembly about the High Seas Treaty. Let's listen to some of what was said there.
2 years ago, when the new treaty for the high seas, which is actually called BBNJ, right? Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, was open for signatures. Our president signed it. He was one of the first one in signing it. We were the second country in the world in ratifying that new international agreement. And we are very, very happy that Friday, just before the General Assembly, the 60 ratification came in.
So, Serjan, how significant is this treaty? What does it do?
Yes, this is a very relevant step forward in terms of preservation and protection of the ocean. Brazil is about to sign. It has been approved by the parliament, and the president will sign in probably in the coming months. I think we have now about 75 countries already signed the treaty, and this treaty will consider the areas beyond jurisdiction of the countries. It means it is an opportunity to protect some areas, and the aim is try to protect 30% of the ocean. In protecting them, will give chance to reproduce and to have the biodiversity in these places that will be preserved, and we can then have economic development and in a different basis, in a sustainable basis. And this is the big aim of BBNJ. Next year in March, my institute is organizing a symposium on BB&J in Rio de Janeiro in March. It's an opportunity to discuss how science could contribute for this treat. I hope to see you here in March.
Thomas Gell, we were talking about COP30 a moment ago. That takes place in Brazil next month. What are your expectations on that?
I think that there are many, many opportunities because, again, China has been stepping up nicely to be able to address many of the renewable resources that are needed and develop that. So I think, and unfortunately, the United States has taken a step back, I'm sorry to say. Under the Trump administration, we're falling further behind. We had great progress in the past, so we bring a lot to the table. But now other countries need to step up to be able to get where we need to be. But I think that the universal cooperation is there and can move forward. And I think that from the Sustainable Development Goals that we had developed many years ago, concentrating on that, concentrating on the oceans, concentrating on renewable resources, we have a lot of opportunities moving forward, and COP30 will be instrumental in being able to get international cooperation to make some major strides.
And Thomas, do you expect any significant progress at COP30 on finance?
I do, because I think, again, China is stepping up. They've got a lot going on. The EU has been examining what they can do to be able to move to the equation more. I think that, you know, the world has seen the benefit of investing in particularly the African nations to help them for climate goal reduction, and that will pay a lot of benefits off as we're moving forward, because by helping Africa achieve their goals financially to be able to accomplish these goals, we will be able to see a greater impact on it. It's the basic Hawthorne effect, where you can have 20% of the money go to take care of 80% of the problem. And that's what I think we can do with the international financial arrangements to be able to help the underdeveloped countries to move forward at a much faster pace.
Yixing Xu, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said there are 5 crucial areas that need global attention, and he listed them as energy, methane, forests, heavy industry, and climate justice. I mean, just looking at some of them, how do they fit in with China's priorities, you know, those priorities that were outlined in those nationally determined contributions, that sort of progress report that China presented?
Yeah, I think China also focused on very similar areas, like maybe, for example, starting from energy, right? So energy is almost the foundation of the whole economy.
One moment, Thomas.
And cheaper.
Go ahead, Yixing Xu.
Yeah, and the cheaper, abundant, reliable energy is essential for economic development. And I think right now, China is trying to continuously driving down the cost of renewable energy, like wind, solar, and battery, and also EVs. I think all these are essential for kind of supporting other goals listed out. For example, including the heavy industry. Right now, heavy industry is still emitting a lot of carbon emissions, and it is technically challenging for heavy industry to reduce these emissions, such as making steel or making cement or concrete. These are still kind of emission-heavy industries. I think by using clean energy, it can produce clean electricity in a reliable way, and that can help invent or innovate into new technologies to help us make more steels and concrete in a more sustainable way. So I think all these factors are kind of linked together. Right. And also, I think China has also made commitment around the forestry, and that's also a huge contribution to reduce the carbon emission.
Sergio and Estevan, of course, you are in the host country for COP30. It will take place in Brazil next month, as I said. Now, Brazil is calling this, they've termed it the implementation COP. So what do you think will happen?
Yeah, the expectation is that the countries will bring the national determined contribution in a more effective way. And we are what our president called a true COP30 that will be in an emergency call in terms of the climate change. And the decisions that the governments will take in this COP30 will be determinant what going to happen with our planet. We think that in terms of Brazil, another point that is very, very important, it's the South-South cooperation, the global South cooperation with technology transfer. And I think China has a very important role in this aspect. And I believe that this point could progress in the discussions in COP30. In addition to, of course, Amazon protection and stop deforestation. These are key points to be treated here. And also just transition with social positive impacts.
Okay, Michael Shank, I've only got 30 seconds. It's 10 years since the Paris Accords were signed. What does the report card look like?
Ooh, I'd have to say most countries are getting a poor grade on this. I was there 10 years ago. I brought a bunch of mayors to Paris to meet with the Pope to talk climate, and a lot has changed since then. I think the narratives are shifting, and they're shifting fast. Certainly in the US, that's the case, as we're banning words like climate change and more in US government documents. I will say President Xi's commitment to pollution-free vehicles and making them mainstream hit an interesting cultural note there, as well as establishing a climate adaptive society. I thought that was a really interesting framing. So I think we will need new narratives and new frames to carry us forward.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.